Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 17th of March. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 387 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Slovakia's government has today approved a plan to give Ukraine its fleet of 13 Soviet-era MiG-29 fighter jets, becoming the second NATO member country to heed the Ukrainian government's pleas for warplanes to help defend against Russia's invasion. Denmark was open to the idea of sending fighter jets to Ukraine to help its war effort against the Russian invasion, the Danish defence minister said today, according to the state broadcaster DR. The Kremlin said that fighter planes supplied to Kyiv will be destroyed and will not change the course of the war. China and Russia have confirmed that China's President Xi Jinping will make a state visit to Moscow on the 20th and the 1st and 22nd of March. The White House said yesterday that talks between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and China's president would be a good thing, but it warned Beijing against taking a one-sided view of the conflict. The UK has called on China to use President Xi's trip to Moscow next week to encourage President Putin to withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine. Russia's Defense Secretary Sergei Shoigu has presented state awards to the pilots of the Su-27 fighter planes involved in the drone incident over the Black Sea last weekend. Finland's President Sauli Niinisto has arrived in Ankara to meet with his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan, raising hopes that the talks will pave the way for Turkey's approval of Finland's NATO membership bid. The Kremlin said a decision on whether to retrieve the downed US Reaper drone from the Black Sea would come from the Russian military. The United Nations office in Geneva said today that discussions on the renewal of a deal allowing the safe export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports were ongoing. Ukraine has said the deal, which expires on Sunday, must be rolled over in full under the existing terms, which provide for a 120-day minimum extension. Kyiv's wartime curfew will be reduced by an hour to boost business, the administration of the Ukrainian capital announced earlier today. Russia has committed a wide range of war crimes in Ukraine, including willful killings, systematic torture, and the deportation of children, according to a report from the UN-backed Independent International Commission of Inquiry published yesterday, and we'll discuss that story in more detail in a moment. President Putin has told his country's leading billionaires that Russia is facing a sanctions war, and at least one person has been killed and two people injured in a blast and a fire at a building belonging to Russia's FSB security service in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Greg McCarra. Greg is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Independence Foundation. He's convener of the SNP Trades Union Group, an executive member of the Scottish Independence Convention. Previously, Greg was an SNP councillor in West Lothian, a lecturer at Napier University, and president of the EIS University Lecturers Association. Greg, good evening. How are you keeping?
Not bad at all. And actually, the part that I enjoyed doing of all of those was playing ragtime guitar. But as a wee update, I've moved on from being trade union group exec, but as well as that, I'm co-convener now of the Scottish Independence Convention, and jobs change. I bet you've changed a couple of these kind of roles over the years yourself, Andrew. But,
I'll update your CV in my records. Don't worry. That's no grand. Thanks, Greg. As I mentioned a moment ago, the International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Alexeyevna Lvova-Belova, for the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The International Criminal Court's pre-trial judges assessed that there were reasonable grounds to believe that each suspect bears responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population and that of unlawful transfer of population from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation to the prejudice of Ukrainian children. The judges considered issuing secret warrants but decided to make them public, and that because that could contribute to the prevention of the further commission of crimes. Moscow has said it does not recognise the jurisdiction of the ICC. Wayne Jordash, a Kyiv-based international human rights lawyer and the managing partner of Global Rights Compliance, agreed that warrants for Putin and Lvova-Belova were likely to be the first of many. More will come over the next few months. This has got to be a sort of warning shot across the bow. This is the prosecutor just getting something onto the docket, Jordash said. The ICC prosecutor, Edinburgh-born Karim Khan KC, began war crimes investigations in Ukraine just over a year ago. The Russian leadership has been completely overt about its taking Ukrainian children to Russia and placing them in camps or putting them up for adoption by Russian families. On the 16th of February, Lvova-Belova appeared on television telling President Putin about the program and revealing that she herself had adopted a 15-year-old child from Mariupol, the southeastern Ukrainian city that was devastated and is now occupied by Russian forces. Now, I know what it means to be a mother of a child from the Donbass. It's hard, but we definitely love each other. I think we can handle anything, Lvova-Belova told Putin at the meeting at his Novo-Ogaryovo residence near Moscow. The televised conversation may have been a factor in Khan's decision to issue his first requests for arrest warrants against President Putin and Lvova-Belova. There is a clear case against Putin, Jordash said, so I think it's good to see the prosecutor focusing on children's rights. I think this is what international prosecutors would have failed to do over the past 20 years, so this is a good focus, as it's one of the worst crimes being committed. Now, I thought I should just give you a brief paragraph from the statement issued by the prosecutor, Karim Khan, QC, this afternoon. He said, on the basis of the evidence collected and analysed by my office pursuant to its independent investigations, the pre-trial chamber has confirmed that there are reasonable grounds to believe that President Putin and Ms. Lvova-Belova bear criminal responsibility for the unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, contrary to Article 8 and Articles 82A and 82B of the Rome Statute. Incidents identified by my office include the deportation of at least hundreds of children taken from orphanages and children's care homes. Many of these children, we allege, have since been given for adoption in the Russian Federation. He went on, since taking up my position as prosecutor, I have emphasised that the law must provide shelter to the most vulnerable on the front lines, and that we also must put the experiences of children in conflict at the centre of our work. So, Greg, the Karim Khan QC, they're talking about providing shelter for the most and protection for the most vulnerable on the front lines. Now, it strikes me that, for example, we've had reports this week from Agence France Presse of phosphorus weapons being used on the front lines, and phosphorus weapons are banned from being used against civilians. And of course, obviously, people are still living on the front lines. So does that prosecution of the war and the allegations that we've heard from the ICC today, does that underline once more just how cheaply the Russian state appears to value human life?
Absolutely. In fact, it's not just that you can't use phosphorus weapons against civilians. You can't attack civilians at all. It's against the Geneva Convention. They're not a target. The targets, if there is to be a war, if there are to be targets, there should be military targets, and only that. What we're seeing in here is straight out of the Hitler Handbook, I'm afraid to say. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its occupation of parts for some time, all of Crimea for several years, and then the Donbass region partially, and now much more fully. That's really just about expanding its land, living room, Lebensraum. It's like the Nazi Anschluss. It's like the takeover of the Sudetenland. The similarities are extremely close. And of course, having grabbed those bits of extra land, the Nazi regime of Germany decided to have a little bit more. They called it Western Europe. And that's maybe an ambition of Russia, just to keep expanding. We know they've got their eyes on Moldova and possibly beyond. What they actually want to do is recreate the Russian Empire. But let's go back to the human rights part of it. What we have in here is a different type of ethnic cleansing We saw that in Serbia, where that was largely done by simply the murder of people of the culture which the majority didn't want. It can be done in, I don't want to call it more subtle, but let's just say different ways. And by assimilating people from one culture into another, changing their language, changing their beliefs, their thoughts, changing their doctrine, and then possibly transporting them back into the country they came from. That's a way of transforming Russification of Eastern Ukraine. So it's not an unprecedented process. It's just a despicable process, and we're right to resist it. Nobody likes war. Nobody wants to see a continuation of Ukraine war. There's only one thing worse than assisting Ukraine in fighting against this, and that is not helping Ukraine fight against this. So we have no choice but to act as we're doing. And by the way, it's the hallmark of a totalitarian regime that really doesn't care about the attitudes of others, that it won't get involved in such a body as the International Criminal Court. I don't need to say any more than that.
No, your point's very well made there, Greg, and I'm sure that you and I will be talking about further arrest warrants and further activities by the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC over the next few weeks and months as his investigations continue. But we'll move on to our next item this evening, because the UK will be the only economy in the G20, apart from Russia, to shrink this year, as high inflation, the energy crisis, and low productivity hinder the recovery, according to a leading international institution. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, said all major EU economies will expand in 2023 at a stronger pace than it had forecast last year, leaving the UK and Russia, the only members of the G20 group of wealthy nations, to suffer a decline. In its half-yearly outlook, the Paris-based organisation said the UK economic outlook had improved slightly compared with its forecast in November of a 0.4% contraction, largely as a result of falling gas prices, but it would still shrink by 0.2% this year. Germany's economy was expected to contract this year by 0.3%, but the EU's largest economy has recovered quickly from its dependence on Russian gas and global shortages of raw materials, and is now forecast to grow by 0.3%. Under the heading "A Fragile Recovery," the OECD said it expected to see a further rebound in consumer confidence and business output this year across its 39 member states, who include other countries in the G20 such as Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and the US, but not Russia. It said there were more positive signs now that food and energy prices were falling back and that the Chinese economy had fully reopened. However, the slow recovery from the pandemic would continue while central banks kept interest rates high and the Ukraine war persists. Global growth is projected to remain below trend rates in 2023 and 2024 at 2.6% and 2.9% respectively, with policy tightening continuing to take effect. Nonetheless, a gradual improvement is projected through 23-24 as the drag on incomes from high inflation recedes, it said. Last year, the organisation said the UK would be the economy hit hardest by the Ukraine war. The OECD said it was concerned that services companies were pushing through strong price increases, which it blamed in part on a lack of competition in many member countries. The UK has one of the highest rates of inflation, the biggest reliance on gas, and the lowest labour productivity, defined as output per hour, among its major competitors, Alvaro Pereira, the OECD's interim chief economist, said. So, Greg, firstly, in response to the report that the OECD issued yesterday, the OECD recommends that member countries, the OECD group said that struggling governments should undertake structural reforms that enhance business dynamism, lower barriers to cross-border trade, and alleviate supply chain constraints. So, given that's the recipe to improve things that the OECD is recommending, is there any chance of any of that from Westminster? I don't think there's any of those elements in current Tory government policy.
Fortunately, in many respects, not totally, but in many respects, we are able to take a different tack, taking all of this in Scotland. I have to say that measuring how well a country is doing purely in terms of GDP growth or recession, depending, is not always the best way. I like the idea of a well-being economy where you measure in terms of, well, sometimes it's quite simply just a happiness, how content people are. And their mental health, their physical health, and it's not just about their wealth. I do feel, though, that the way a government interacts with its own people is quite important in this as well. And whether you've got Germany with a plus 0.3% growth or the UK with a minus 0.3, I'll call it recession, they're relatively marginal. In Germany, they're not boasting, we are doing magnificently. They're saying, we've only just escaped recession and we're working hard at it. However, I listened to Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's Question Time just the other day, and he was boasting about, we are not in recession. We've missed it by about that, so we're not in recession. Oh, come on. A bit of honesty in saying that the policies that have been pursued by him and his how many predecessors? Well, not counting predecessors, are going nowhere. The other countries that I'm referred to, the support for their governments, once you've had an election, support slips. That always happens, every country. But in Germany, it's dropped a little bit for the CDU, and Green coalition. In the UK, it's crashed for the Tories. So that tells you a little bit that Tories are trying to pretend that things are fine, everything's rosy, we're doing very well. People know otherwise, and that's going to come back and bite them at some stage. So I personally prefer, as I said, the idea of a well-being economy, and there's too much. The OECD can make suggestions, but I wouldn't adopt wholesale every recommendation to say, let's pick on the one of productivity. Productivity sounds good. What that means is you get more goods produced. If you think of it in Victorian times, there are more wheels made by each person working on the assembly line. Right. But you know what that means? They're driven faster and harder, and they're driven to their deaths sooner. Good that we've had trade unions since that time, and maybe things have improved. Because some countries, like in France, where the trade unions say productivity is what drives people to an early death. You're trying to get more out of them, and I'll maybe pick up on that later on. So let's not use as a judgment of how well we're doing the figures which are used by wealthy people as a means of making themselves wealthier by getting more return on their investment. Okay.
Very sage advice, Greg. Thank you, and a great perspective for this evening. Because, as you say, we'll likely touch on a couple of these points again as we continue our discussion this evening. Thank you. We'll move to our next item now, because the SNP has said that post-Brexit funding to replace vital EU support is failing Scotland after it emerged that the UK Infrastructure Bank, the UKIB, which was set up after Brexit, has fallen short of previous support provided by the EU. As reported by the Financial Times, the UK Infrastructure Bank has provided barely a fifth of the funding that was handed out by its predecessor, the European Investment Bank. In the 5 years previous to Brexit, the European Investment Bank provided £5 billion a year to support projects in the UK. So far, UKIB has provided just £1.5 billion of funding. This comes after research by Bloomberg found that Scotland was losing out on levelling up funding, another key pillar of the Westminster government replacing previous funding from the EU. Commenting, the SNP Levelling Up spokesperson, Chris Stevens MP, said, "Post-Brexit funding is failing Scotland as we are seeing nowhere near the support that was provided by the EU compared to what is on offer from the UK. Whether it be Levelling Up or the UK Investment Bank, Scotland is being shortchanged by Westminster." Far from levelling up, many of the poorest areas in Scotland have lost out on funding in favour of wealthier Tory areas in England. EU funding helped support massive infrastructure projects in Scotland, but UK replacement funding is falling far short of what was on offer before Scotland was dragged out of the European Union against our will. So, Greg, this is kind of predictable, isn't it? The myriad of part funded by the EU posters and signs across, in particular, the Highlands and Islands, are testament to what the EU used to invest. And there was never any way that the UK government would properly replace that. We know that Westminster money is only ever spent in the constituencies of Tory MPs.
It was more than predictable. There were many people shouting about it in the run up to the Brexit vote, and then after the vote, still pointing out the fallacy of the argument. But sadly, not enough people listened to that. When I say shouting out about it, was written in large letters on the bus. How much money extra was going to be saved in the EU and spent directly on the NHS, hundreds of millions of pounds. Not a penny of that has happened. And the story was, we're sending a fortune to the EU, so now we can stop sending that, we can spend it ourselves. The reality was, we're sending money to the EU, and we're getting money back from the EU, and it was being invested in major projects, especially capital projects, building, hospitals, schools, roads, bridges. What we would have got from the EU over the coming 3-year period would have been something like £550 million. What we're actually getting is the replacement money from the UK, who promised to replace all of that money, so we should have got £550 million for the next 3 years. Instead, we're going to get just over £200 million, a shortfall of £250 million over 3 years. So when people look at their council tax bills and see that they've been increased by something between 5 and about 8%, around about that, across the country, and they say, oh, that's terrible. And then they look at the works, the physical works that should be going on in their area, and they say, why aren't we investing in improving our infrastructure? They might have a little think about, instead of criticising the Scottish Government, which gets its pocket money from London, they might actually think about London having taken the money from Scotland, kept it, stopped giving money to Europe, kept it, given a little bitty back, part of it back, but kept the rest of it, and then blamed Europe and blamed Scotland for any failures to go ahead with major projects in Scotland. We've been gaslighted, and so not everybody's going to see that, but it is up to those who know that that's what's happening. The onus is on us to actually talk to our family, friends, colleagues, and just tell them what's happening, because it's not been reported well in the media. We know fine well that there was the Tories didn't actually ban, but tried to ban the use of the word Brexit in the BBC. Stop using it. Don't blame things on Brexit, because Brexit's didn't really happen. It's not had any effect on anything if it did. No, we've been gaslighted. So it's sad it's happened. The rest of the UK voted for it. Scotland didn't. We are where we are. We know what we can do about it.
Thanks, Greg. And I was going to ask you a little bit about the politics of it as well, just for a second. In particular, as a former councillor, we heard on Wednesday in the budget that undoubtedly to give a wee boost to the career of Douglas Ross, the Chancellor announced in the budget speech direct financial support to repair a bridge in the south of Elgin, which is in Douglas Ross's constituencies, plural. Now, the Moray Council had identified that the Clodagh Bridge was not a priority for repair. Obviously, difficult spending decisions have to be taken by local authorities, but they had clearly assessed that the Clodagh Bridge was not a priority. So in what way does Westminster know better than the local authority what requires to be repaired and what the priorities are for spending in local council areas and local council responsibilities?
Westminster is the font of all knowledge. There isn't anything that they don't know, and there's absolutely nothing they need to hear. And if anybody tries to tell them, they sure as hell won't be listening. So what it comes down to is if a country's government gets so introspective that it actually believes that it is right and doesn't need any other opinions or advice, then that's a very dangerous road for it to go down. The money that's given for repairs of bridges or any other such work, by the terms of the devolution scheme agreed by well over 80% of the people in Scotland in 1997 and signed off by Westminster, that money should, if it's transport, the money should be given to Scotland, and then Scotland can decide whether to put all of it into transport, less of it into, or more than that sum into transport. And the same with all the other devolved areas. Devolution is about taking a sum of money and choosing your own priorities for different areas of spend, and then within those areas of spend, choosing your priorities, where and what to do. And that's been taken away from us. Another example of that is the Levelling Up Fund. There's going to be a third round of that soon. Levelling Up, which I prefer to refer to as levelling down, since the bulk of the money supposed to be going to areas which have not received the largesse from government before, and where they might be seen to have fallen behind economically compared with the overheated southeast of England. They were supposed to be getting money from the Level Up Fund. Only a paltry portion of that was been received by Scotland. The third round, not expecting much better than that. There were only 2 schemes approved the last time round, dozens around England. And as I say, the bulk of the money has gone to Tory supporting wealthy areas, and Glasgow, which put in 7 bids in this second round, received money for, guess how many? 0. And if that's levelling up by taking money away from the poorer places and giving it to richer places, I stand by my assertion. It's levelling down.
Yep. Thanks, Greg. A great perspective there. Appreciate that. We'll move on to our next item now, because the Conservative Party put pressure on the BBC not to describe a claim by Boris Johnson that Keir Starmer failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile as false, The Guardian has been told. The allegation made by Johnson in February last year prompted fury, including from within his own party, and he eventually rode back on the claim. However, behind the scenes, Conservative Party headquarters was pressing the BBC not to describe it as a false accusation. The BBC resisted the demand. The furore first erupted when Johnson accused the Labour leader of failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile for child sex abuse more than a decade ago, when Starmer was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. An official CPS report confirmed that there was no reference to any involvement by Starmer in any of the decision-making. After the exchange at PMQs, a senior aide to Johnson quit, saying his intervention was scurrilous. 3 days later, Johnson backtracked on the claim, saying he was referring to Starmer's leadership of the organisation at the time of the Savile decision, rather than implying that he was personally involved. It has been reported that BBC sources said that there had been communication from Conservative Campaign Headquarters, CCHQ, urging it not to use the term false, with points raised about Starmer taking credit for positive records from his time at the CPS. A Conservative Party spokesperson said the requests were part of normal media management and that conversations were professional and courteous. It is understood that CCHQ does not consider them to amount to pressure. The revelation that the Conservatives were pressurising the BBC over Johnson's false Savile claims comes after leaked emails from between 2020 and 2022 show that the BBC came under pressure from Number 10 over the corporation's political reporting. Now, a BBC spokesperson said the BBC makes its own independent editorial decisions, and none of these messages show otherwise. Like all news organisations, we are frequently contacted by representatives from all political parties. And I just wondered why this story is appearing just now. I wondered if it was to suggest and assert that the BBC still has political independence, when in fact, of course, we know that its chair is a Tory donor, its non-executive director is a former Tory director of communications, and the head of news programmes used to work for GB News.
All coincidences, surely. By the way, you forgot to mention Gary Lineker in Match of the Day. So let's start off with that one, which is that when somebody, it's actually carved on the wall outside Broadcasting House, the words of George Orwell when he was, I can't remember them entirely, but basically saying that the first thing you must do is tell the truth and allow people the opportunity, even if you disagree with what they say, they have the right to say it. As Voltaire said, I may disagree with every word you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. And BBC started off in its initial charter believing that. Now, it's not the defender so much of your right to free speech as defender of the BBC licence fee, because it knows if it alienates the current Westminster government, then they will exact their retribution by either freezing during a period of high inflation, freezing the level of licence fee, which is a cut, real terms, or cutting the licence fee, which is spurring down the BBC to do that. And maybe the Tories are loosest enough to do that, but certainly we're seeing the BBC kowtowing a bit too much in this. The order of events in here. Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions in England, an extremely senior job. He would have been signing off on who was and wasn't getting prosecuted on certain issues. That's a fact. That was his job. It applies to the current DPP. And then we had the issue with Jimmy Savile, which later on the Tories, sorry, not the Tories, not let's talk about the one person, it was Boris Johnson, claimed that he'd failed to prosecute, had chosen not to prosecute. It's a lie. And then there was a partial retraction on that. At that point, had they kept on retracting and admitted each time that Boris Johnson had said that, admitted each time, yes, he said that, it was wrong, it was absolutely untrue, he shouldn't have said it, and he's retracted. Okay, he says so many ridiculous things that it's just added to the list. But for the BBC, as you say, and as we've reported in here, for them to say, stop using that word, lie, even though he told what by any definition was a lie and did retract it, to say stop telling people that he told a lie is trying to retrospectively alter the truth of the past. Okay, that's what a lie largely is. And that is such disgraceful behaviour by the BBC that, along with trying to suppress freedom of speech from their freelance contributors, it's getting a bit scary. When the public broadcaster becomes an arm of the establishment and of the government, then it's failing in its duty. It's become Pravda. And that's which, as many of you will know, Pravda being Russian for truth. It was a beautifully ironic name for the Russian broadcaster, or newspaper. So maybe the BBC ought to change its name to something suitably Russian and just go on with its backlash.
That's a great suggestion, Greg. And just for clarity, next to the Orwell statue outside the BBC, it's written on the wall, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. But let's move on. I try not to quote Orwell if I can help it on these programs, and here we are again. But anyway, let's move on to our next item, because refinery strikes have escalated in France as the Interior Minister spoke of protesters wreaking havoc across the country, and some MPs called for police protection amid anger at the government pushing through a rise in the pension age without a parliamentary vote. More than 300 people were arrested across France overnight during spontaneous protests against Emmanuel Macron's decision to bypass Parliament and force through his unpopular pension changes, including raising the eligible age from 62 to 64. Macron instructed the Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, to invoke Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which allows the government to adopt a bill without a parliamentary vote, because he said there was too much economic risk if MPs voted against the bill. As opposition politicians accused the government of a brutal and undemocratic approach, demonstrators gathered in Paris and other cities. About 200 protesters briefly blocked traffic on the Paris Ring Road early this morning. In the energy sector, strikers voted to halt production at one of the country's largest refineries by this weekend, or Monday at the latest, a representative of the CGT union said. Workers had already been on a rolling strike at the northern site, Total Energies de Normandie, but halting production would escalate the industrial action and spark fears of fuel shortages. Strikers continue to deliver less fuel than normal from several other sites. Macron's plan to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 was passed by the surprise last-minute use of a special constitutional power after 2 months of coordinated nationwide strikes and some of the biggest protests in decades. The government took the decision after it feared it could not secure a majority of MPs to vote in favour. Unions immediately called for another day of mass strikes and protests for next Thursday, calling the government's move a complete denial of democracy. Opposition parties will call a vote of no confidence in the government on Monday. For this to pass, it would require large numbers of MPs from the right-wing party Les Républicains to back it. The party has said it will not do so, and the government has so far survived all attempted no-confidence votes in recent months. So, Greg, this sounds serious. 300, more than 300 arrests. That's more arrests than you get at an Old Firm game. But to move on from that for a second, President Macron couldn't get the votes to support the plans for his pensions reform, so eventually has implemented them by presidential decree. Is that not rather a risky path for an economic policy which folks in France clearly do not support?
If there's an imminent threat, if there's an emergency, then it's been common for presidents with major executive powers, common from around the world, to use executive authority. In the States, it's been done on many occasions. But there wasn't an imminent threat. It wasn't as if suddenly the country was going to run out a week next Tuesday of money to pay the pensions for people who become new pensioners. Any change to pension schemes tend to be planned many years, if not a decade, in advance. And this is something which wouldn't be brought in straight away. So that the use of those executive powers, it's okay to use them on occasion when you have suppression urgency about it. If that doesn't exist, there's a need not to use them because you're debasing those powers and you're actually becoming dictatorial, becoming autocratic. That is a very bad look. And France doesn't like people who become dictatorial, who become autocratic. I refer you to the late 1700s for how France has dealt with that in the past. I don't think they'll be taking the tumbrels down the Champs-Elysees to the guillotine anytime soon, but they have other methods of bringing down governments, and they've done it many times. So it's very unwise. On the pension issue itself, I have to declare a non-interest, which is that I don't need to personally worry about any further raise to the pension age in the UK. Because I'm already getting. Although they could, hey, serious government, they could do it retrospectively and say everybody's got a pension, they're not getting it anymore until you're 75. Are you ruling that out? Come on, let's be real. So there is that issue, but there are other people that have been affected in this country. The WASPy women are the ones that I'm the most concerned about, who from often a very young age worked hard all their lives, were told you're retiring at 60, it's okay, work your socks off, but you can retire at 60, raise your families, do all the work, while all these lazy men are off at the pub, you can do all the work, and then you get to retire at 60 because you are the one that's knackered. And then coming on 60, we're told, oh, by the way, we're raising your retirement age to, let's choose an arbitrary figure like 65, 66, or whatever, and they had to work on. That was shocking. The reality is that around the world, people on average, not all socioeconomic groups, but on average, are living longer. Although there was a bit of a reduction in that over last year, quite common throughout the world, including Scotland. But so realistically, if you have fewer people creating wealth and more people retired, then there is an issue about getting the money to pay those pensions. But something's not referred to in this is if you have somebody who has a pension, what do they do with that pension? They spend it. If they have other earnings, they pay tax on part of it. If they spend it and they pay VAT on it, they actually contribute to the economy. So paying pensions, and here is where maybe I should declare a vested interest, paying even higher pensions, then that actually is a boost to the economy. And the roughly 10% increase in that is going to be quite useful for a boost to the economy in the UK. France, I get what they're saying. France has traditionally got a very high productivity, and as such, working fewer years but producing more towards the GDP each year per person means that across the working period they've contributed as any other country, which is lower productivity but retire older. So they have a case in that, and the unions should be listened to on that, because if we want to make them work longer, we really have to have a look at what effect is it having on the lifestyle and the well-being economy is what I'm talking about in here. They should, in France, look at the effect it has in the air, and could they change it so that it's feasible for somebody who's dying on his feet at 60 to have to not just retire at 62 but at 64, and who knows what after that, because we know fine well, like the Tories are doing just now, once you start increasing the retirement age, you increase it further and further, and the next rise is, for the UK is been rumoured it's going to be brought forward to a couple of years from now instead of several years from now.
Thanks, Greg. Now, we'll move on to our next item now, because cash-short banks have borrowed about $300 billion from the Federal Reserve in the past week the central bank announced yesterday. Nearly half the money, $143 billion, went to holding companies for two major banks that failed over the past week, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, triggering widespread alarm in the financial markets. The Fed did not identify the banks that received the other half of the funding or say how many of them did so. The holding companies for the two failed banks were set up by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which has taken over both banks. The money they borrowed was used to pay their uninsured depositors, with bonds owned by both banks posted as collateral. The FDIC has guaranteed the repayment of the loans, the Fed said. The figures provide a first glimpse of the scale of the Fed's assistance to the financial sector after these banks collapsed over the last weekend. The rest of the money was borrowed by banks seeking to raise cash, likely, at least in part, to pay off depositors who are trying to withdraw their money. Many mega banks, such as Bank of America, have reported receiving inflows of funds from smaller banks since the bank failures last weekend. An additional $153 billion in borrowing from the Fed over the past week came through a long-standing program called the discount window. It amounted to a record level for that program. Banks can borrow from the discount window for up to 90 days. Typically in a given week, only about $4 or $5 billion is borrowed through this program. It was $153 billion last week. The Fed has lent an additional $11.9 billion from a new lending facility it announced on Sunday. The new program enables banks to raise cash and pay depositors who withdraw money. Michael Feroli, an economist at JP Morgan Chase, said in a research note that the Fed's assistance is so far about half what it was during the financial crisis, the last financial crisis, 15 years ago. The past week's emergency lending from the Fed seeks to address a leading cause of the collapse of two banks who are owned billions of dollars of seemingly safe Treasury and other bonds that paid low interest rates. Over the past year, as the Fed steadily raised its benchmark interest rates, yields on longer-term Treasury and other bonds rose. That in turn reduces the value of the lower-yielding Treasury bonds that the banks held. As a result, the banks couldn't raise enough cash from the sale of their Treasury bonds to pay the many depositors who were trying to withdraw their money from the banks. It amounted, I think, to a classic bank run. So, Greg, does the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and two other US banks closed last weekend, does it reopen, and also speculation about the fate of Credit Suisse in Europe, might it reopen concerns about whether banks, on the one hand, are businesses which can and should be run at some level of risk, or if, on the other hand, they should be run as public utilities upon which we all depend?
I don't know if you noticed when you started talking about the financing of banks, if you noticed my eyes glazing a little bit at that point, Andrew. I don't claim to be a kind of expert in this area, and neither are the economists or the bankers. Or as Eddie George, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, there are there are three types of economists: those who can count and those who can't count. Yeah, I stand by that. The theory of money and what it stands for. There are so many new theories around, all competing with each other, of what does money represent. The fact that we learned about quantitative easing a few years ago, where the government needed more money, so it just printed it. That was it, printed it literally. And that's where they got the money from. People used to go to jail for having these things hidden in their cellars, and if the ink was still wet on the paper that we're trying to pass across the counter. But hey ho, banks can do it legally, apparently. In the States, of course, we remember in 2008 when the whole banking and economic system across the world began to collapse. It was on the basis of one bank, big bank, albeit, in the States collapsing, and the government there choosing not to bail it out. There were consequences for that, and for all that the Federal Reserve is supposedly independent of government, just like the Bank of England, as the central bank for the UK, is supposedly independent of the government. It's just it's got to follow certain rules set down. That's a funny form of independence. But nonetheless, I understand to a certain extent what it did. They might not want to see the triggering of another recession similar to how it was triggered in 2008. Folk would get a bit nervous about that. The lessons to be learned from it, I am simply not sure at all. The money seems to be capable of being created when it's needed, given to whoever theoretically needs it. It's not actually spent on the production of any goods. It's just to maintain some abstract concept of what a bank is, holding some abstract concept of money, which isn't based in anything. In England, it's not been based in anything since Henry VIII took money off the gold standard, where he would give somebody a certain amount of gold, solid gold, instead of bits of paper or whatever. Hey, it's just such an abstract system. I don't claim expertise in it. I wish them well, but if it collapses again, here's a lesson that we should learn in this country. Not just UK, but I'm talking particularly in Scotland. We had the Royal Bank of Scotland, which now is no longer a Scottish bank, not even remotely. In Scotland, what happened, and the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown was boastful about it, that he bailed out the banks and saved the economy and saved the country. Yeah, okay. But actually what he did was he trapped the people into having to pay the burden of that bailout over generations. So freed the banks, but jailed the people in poverty or reduced income, as opposed to Iceland, where they quite literally jailed the bankers and thus freed the people from any serious consequences of the banks going bust. Let's look at little Iceland and how they deal with these crises, and maybe we could learn a better lesson than the UK or, for that matter, the USA.
Thanks, Greg. That's a very good point. We'll move back to Scotland now for our next story, because a fund that helps to tackle inequality and discrimination has supported more than 115,000 people in its first year. The Scottish Government's Equality and Human Rights Fund is providing £21 million in grants over 3 years to 48 organisations working with diverse communities to further equality and protect human rights. Funded initiatives include advice helplines, mental wellbeing sessions, English classes and benefits advice. The Equalities Minister, Christina McKelvie, visited the West of Scotland Regional Equality Council, the WSREC, in Glasgow to see how people have benefited from their work. Ms McKelvie said, "We want to build a fairer, more equal Scotland which is free from discrimination and where the human rights of everyone are respected, protected and fulfilled. I was very pleased to visit the WSREC and see the range of activities that they deliver. For example, their cost of living advice service for people from minority ethnic communities has helped to boost family incomes and lift people and children out of poverty. The WSREC is just one of 48 organisations that receive grants from the Equality and Human Rights Fund. From advocacy support to public education, these organisations are transforming the lives of the thousands of people that they work with." So, Greg, this particular scheme, the Equality and Human Rights Fund, is delivered and managed by a charity called Inspiring Scotland. So do you think, is this a good example of the government and the third sector working together in collaboration in order to deliver schemes like this?
Absolutely. I don't believe in privatisation, in handing over the work of government to private companies so that they can cut a profit from it. But working with the third sector, in case, I would never confuse the two. Working with the third sector of charities and trusts and such bodies is wonderful because, frankly, they've often got their ear closer to the ground and engaging directly with the people at the interface with that problem. We're dealing with people who are homeless, who are poor, who are hungry, who are ill, and they know the problems and they can talk to government and often in delivering it, the people who hear and see what the problem are the ones who can reach and help the problem. It is perfectly right to give funding in that direction. Thoroughly in favour of it. As well as that, the equalities are fundamental to living in a decent country, and it's something we should never skimp on. And it counts internationally as well. I was horrified a few years back when the UK government decided it wanted to reduce the percentage of its budget that would be spent on international development. Let's take money away from poorer countries because we're not quite as rich as we want to be. That's never a good policy. And I think at home we should judge how decent a country, and let's just use that nice simple word. Let's judge how decent a country we live in by how well the poorer off and the people who are struggling in whatever way they're assisted to get back on their feet, and not just kind of put a sticking plaster on any problems that they have, but help them to get solutions to their problems so that they can live a fuller life. So every penny spent like that is that's where I'll talk about investment in a different way. That's what I think is genuine investment. And I will use that again as investment in the well-being, because it is about the well-being of people across the board and respecting every group and not leaving any behind. And if a country does that, that's a good country.
That's a very good point, Greg. That's very well pulled together, and great context back to the wellbeing discussions that we started this evening with. Now, I've got two little pieces of news from Scotland, and then we'll move to our final item. Firstly, Bute House, the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland, will close to enable essential repair work to take place. Work is due to commence on the 17th of April and last for 20 weeks, with a target completion date of the 1st of September. Meetings of the Scottish Cabinet will take place at St Andrew's House for the duration of the works. Temporary alternative arrangements are being put in place for the First Minister's accommodation and working requirements while they are in Edinburgh. And I should also mention in passing that just before we came on air this evening, Murray Foot has tweeted that he has resigned his position with the SNP. Now, let's get to our final item this evening, because the Welsh First Minister has spoken of his emotion at the contemporary resonances he perceived in a letter written by a 15th century Prince of Wales envisioning a country free from the rule of the barbarous English. During a visit to France, Mark Drakeford said he was moved by the Pennell letter sent by Owen Glendower to the King of France, Charles VI, in 1406, asking for his help in his fight against English rule. Mr. Drakeford was shown the original of the letter in the French National Archive in Paris during a trip aimed at strengthening political, business, cultural and sporting links between Wales and France. In the letter, Glendower said he wanted to create a Welsh church free from the authority of Canterbury, and that clergy should be able to speak Welsh. He also talked of founding 2 universities. Mark Drakeford said, "The Pennell letter is probably the most single celebrated letter in Welsh history, written by Owen Glendower to the French king, asking for help in his campaign against the barbarian English, as it says in the letter." He went on, "I found it a moving experience. I was struck by the contemporary resonances it has, not in relation to what it says about internal UK matters, but the pitch of the letter is that Glendower would establish a separate Welsh church with its headquarters in St David's in southwest Wales, and found 2 new universities, one in the north and one in the south." So, Greg, this letter, perhaps it's a timely reminder of the barbarous nature of the English. No, that's not right. It's a timely reminder of the connections between Celtic nations and continental Europe. Here's a letter written by the Prince of Wales to the French king. And of course, I was reminded that an equally famous letter, our own letter, the Declaration of Arbroath, which was written to the Pope, will go back on public display in Edinburgh during the month of June this year. So is this a timely reminder of the connections between the Celtic nations and nations in continental Europe?
Absolutely, and those connections are profound. You stole my line there. I was going to refer to the parallels there between that and the Declaration of Arbroath, but how can you not draw those parallels? It's exactly the same concept, that the people have the right to self-determination. Nobody should come in and try and nick their country or tell them how to live or speak or whatever, and yet it happens. This Owen Glendower, the last Welsh Prince of Wales, I refer to him as the last actual Prince of Wales, because in the same way as our hero of Scotland in the early 1300s was taken to London and was hung, drawn and quartered. And that was the end of the garrison of Scotland. Similarly, Owen Glendower had exactly the same fate. The title, of course, you can't have a title when you're dead. The King of England took his title and gave it to his son, and the son gave it to the next king, and the next one, and the next one. And when the late Queen was, in recent years, when people are speculating what might happen afterwards, people in Wales are saying, please, when she goes, could you stop passing on the title of Prince of Wales to the eldest son of the King of England? And within days of the Queen dying, Charles had bestowed that title on his son. And then the son went to Wales for a glorious tour around parts of Welsh Wales. And that was really more than unseemly. So I think yep, great words from Owen. And we had similar words from Wallace, and they had a similar fate, but maybe they'll have a similar future. And certainly, if England can't learn the lessons of its barbarism, because hanging, drawing, and quartering the Prince of Wales is not something that Andy would actually ask to happen these days. So the fact that it was okay then tells you maybe they're not learning lessons at all from the past. Oh, by the way, can I what was your last item? I'm trying to remember. You were talking about the Pears to Butte House.
Yes.
You made me. There's going to be lots of people who say, that's terrible money. Scottish Government spending money on itself, doing its houses up and it's very fancy and it'll be a fortune. And you know what? You talked about Macron earlier on. Palace of Versailles is not a wee shack in the outside of Montmartre or anything. You know, it's actually quite a big house. And the White House it stays that way because it gets the odd lick of paint. And you know, these places need a bit of maintenance. But I think of Oscar Wilde, who referred to these cynics and said they know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And these kind of buildings need to be maintained for the sake of national pride. It's got nothing to do with the occupants whatsoever. Anyway,
well said, Greg. Butte House is more than 230 years old, so yes, it needs maintenance. But I'm watching the clock, and I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot and on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland. Click on the wee bell. We will be back tomorrow evening my apologies. We will be back at midday on Sunday with the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, Greg McCarra. Thanks, Greg.
You're very welcome.
On this day in 1328, the First War of Scottish Independence ended with the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton, under which the English Crown recognised that the Kingdom of Scotland is fully independent. And also on this day in 1969, the lifeboat stationed at Longhope in Orkney, the TGB, capsized with the loss of all 8 of the crew during a severe storm. The lifeboat answered a call from the MV Irene, which was in difficulty off South Ronaldsay. A southeasterly gale had been blowing for weeks, and on her way to the casualty, the TGB was swamped by a huge wave with the loss of the entire crew. TGB had launched in traditional RNLI fashion down a slipway from a shed in the tiny community of Brims, a straggle of houses along a single-track road on Hoy. The peninsula of Brimsness sticks down into the Pentland Firth, one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world. The crew all lived in Brims and not a single house was unaffected. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, friends and neighbours were lost. Not only that, but half of the community's workforce was gone. Kevin Kirkpatrick, who's the coxswain today, lost his father, his uncle and grandfather. He was not quite 3 years old at the time. His wife Karen also lost her father, her uncle and her grandfather. Karen had just turned 2 at the time. Eric McFadden left his mother Chrissy and brother Ian. Jimmy Swanson left brothers, sisters and his wife Jean. Those who put the lives of others before themselves when saving lives at sea are never very far from our thoughts. Please keep safe and keep warm, and I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.